I am out at one of my favourite historic homes today, Wolston House at Wacol. Now, the oldest part of this house dates all the way back to about 1852, 1853, when it was built by Dr. Stephen Simpson. But what I love about this place, despite the fact it's just a gorgeous old homestead, is the setting. So it is still surrounded by paddocks here and open fields, and it's really easy to imagine what it would have been like to live here in the early days. And as you're driving in, it sort of builds expectation as you're winding along this road, and it's the last thing you expect to find out here, because on the way you pass prisons, a mental hospital, a sewage treatment plant, a tick research centre, a shooting range. But once you come down this driveway and arrive at Wolston House, it's so easy to picture what guests of the past would have seen when they turned up as well. So I'm going to take you on a tour of the house. I'm so excited to show you this place. Like I said, it's just incredible. So come along with me and we'll have a look around. So Dr. Stephen Simpson bought the land on which Wolston was built in about 1851, and it was a huge holding. He started construction on this house in around about 1852, 1853. He was born in England and he was baptised at a place called Wolston in Warwickshire, so that is where Wolston House gets its name from. He married Sophia Ann Simpson in 1838, and she was about 12 years younger than him. And the story goes that they had actually been engaged since she was about 16. So it was about a 20-year engagement, and he went off and earned some money. He trained as a doctor after being in the army. He travelled as a personal physician to a member of European royalty, made some money, and then he was in a position to propose marriage to her. So they got married, and then not long afterwards they travelled out to Australia, arriving in Sydney in 1840. Sophia gave birth to their first child, a daughter, Sophia, not too long after they arrived. But tragically, both Sophia and her daughter died, leaving Stephen a widower and to mourn the loss of his small family as soon as he arrived in Australia. So a horrible start to his life here. The following year, and I think this might be part of the reason why he did this, he actually got permission to move up to what was then the Moreton Bay convict settlement up here in what is now Brisbane. So he relocated up here. He initially lived in some structures out at the former female convict area out at what is now Eagle Farm. He eventually bought land out here on the Brisbane River at what is now Goodna. He built a cottage for himself, and that is now the location of the Wolston Park Mental Health Facility. He subsequently bought this massive block of land around here, hundreds of acres, and set about building the current building that is here now. So the oldest parts of this house are thought to date back to about 1852, 1853, and were built by Simpson. He lived here for quite a number of years. He held a number of government positions, including Commissioner of Lands, Police Magistrate. He was a member of the very first Legislative Assembly in Queensland after it separated from New South Wales. So he was kind of a big deal, basically. And he had this house built for himself, and it was initially thought for many years that he had only built the core of the house, the centre part of the house, but it's more recently been established by uncovering a letter where he describes that he actually had a 9-roomed house. So now we know that he actually built most of this structure that survives today. So one of the things I love about this place is that the history is continuing to be unearthed as more evidence comes to light, more information about how the building was constructed comes to light as more work is ongoing. And it's also, I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but The process of conserving this house, because it was one of the first properties owned and managed by the Queensland National Trust, it was transferred into their ownership in 1965. They undertook a program of works to bring it, to restore it and to repair it. And they did some work that these days we probably wouldn't do, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So it's also captured in this house is not just the story of Stephen Simpson and the subsequent owners, but it's the evolution of conservation practices in these old buildings as well. So it really just has such a fascinating tale to tell, as well as just being a really cool old building with some fantastic insights into how life was back in the day. So you can see what I mean behind me when I say that the setting is still basically as it would have been when Simpson was running cattle on this property. And that is definitely part of what adds to the charm of this place. It's just so easy to picture what it was like in the old days. And I mean, we're 17 kilometres as the crow flies from Brisbane CBD, we're 15 k's from Ipswich CBD, and there's just no development to be seen. It's quite incredible and yeah, like I said, part of the charm. You can see behind me here that row of trees, that's where the Brisbane River is. And then one of the places I would have loved to have shown you, but unfortunately we can't get access to, is the site of a former mausoleum. Now this was built by one of the later families on the site, who I'll talk about in a little bit, the Goggs family. But they actually had a mausoleum built over on their land towards that direction. It doesn't survive anymore, but apparently there is some sandstone remnants in the field somewhere. I haven't been able to locate it by aerial photos, but I would have loved to have shown you that, but never mind. So let's keep going and I'll show you some of the other parts of the house. Simpson never remarried and he never had any more children, so he actually designated his great nephew John Omni to be his heir. And John travelled to Australia in order to learn about how to run a farm in anticipation of taking over from Simpson. Now, this is just almost unbelievably tragic on the back of what had already happened to his wife and daughter. But John Omni was killed after falling from his horse. So he was only aged, I think, about 20. John died in 1856, and I think that probably put in motion Simpson's plans to return back to England, because he basically started winding up his employment here in Queensland. He put Wolston House on the market, and in 1860 it sold to Matthew Buskell Goggs, and Simpson travelled back to England. So Matthew Buskell Goggs was the next owner of Wolston House. He and his second wife, Anne Gedge, had 10 children together. Well, that's 10 surviving children, 7 of which made it into adulthood. So when they moved into Wolston House, they actually built an extension which housed rooms for all these children. Now, this was located behind me here, and you can see along the bottom here some remnants of it. It was later reclad in brick. It was originally a timber structure. This came about because when the National Trust took over the property in 1965, the idea behind conserving these historic properties was slightly different to what we would do today. So they decided they were going to take the house back to what it would have been like during Simpson's time here, take it back to the original appearance. So they actually demolished the later nursery wing, and they basically set about a program of repairing and restoring the house. They also did a number of other things that we wouldn't do these days, as they reused some of the timber cladding from this nursery extension and used it to reline inside in the dining room. Now, we wouldn't do that today because it confuses the history of the house, and it's very hard to read the construction time frame and methods and things like that now by looking at the house. But that is of interest in itself, as I mentioned, because within the house you can see how methods of conservation and interpretation of these historic homes has changed over the decades. But yes, this was the nursery extension, and I think it was about 2010, they built this terrace and cafe area, and what they did was basically keep it to the footprint of the original nursery. So that's something now that's considered good practice. You're not expanding and building in areas that have never been built on before. You're using existing footprints of buildings. So that, I think, is quite an interesting part of the history of this place in itself as well. When Goggs bought the property off Simpson, there was 2,000 acres of land, and like Simpson before him, he ran cattle on the property. Now the Goggs, as I mentioned, had a large number of children, and a couple of them married very well for themselves into the Lilly and Griffith families, which if you know your Queensland history, you'll know that there was a couple of premiers with those names. So they were a very prominent family, and they hosted a heap of social events here at the house, and you'll see later when I take you in to show you the lounge room that there was actually some timber doors that could be opened to create a ballroom for when they were entertaining. The Goggs family owned the property for a long time, over 40 years, and in 1907 they sold to the Grindle family. The Grindle family converted it into a dairy farm. And one of the coolest rooms, literally the coolest actually as I say this, is the former buttery under the house. Now, as the name suggests, this is where they would take the milk from their dairy cattle and they would convert it into, they would separate the cream off the top and they would make their own butter. And I actually think that these sort of the working rooms of the house are probably my favourite areas because they really showcase how places like this were run. And I don't know if it's something in my genes because I know for a fact that my ancestors were servants and labourers, not the gentry that were up in the ballroom. But I just think they're so fascinating and they're such an insight into the everyday practices on these properties and how self-sufficient they had to be and how basically they had to make everything from scratch because they couldn't just pop to the supermarket and buy things. So these rooms, I think, although some of the most humble, tell some of the most interesting stories about the residents. I absolutely love the kitchen, and one of the coolest features is a bread oven that's actually built into the brick, and I just love the thought that this room would have just been filled with the smell of freshly baked bread. The range is super cool as well. I'm not sure if that's original, but it is my dream to one day own a house that has one of these ranges in it so I can try cooking on it. Apparently it's very hard. The house is furnished, and although none of the furniture belonged to Simpson, there is a few items that are connected with the Goggs family. But regardless of that, there's so many items of historical interest. And in this room, like for example, there's an old ice cream maker from the very early days when, you know, this is a time when manufactured ice was a new invention. Before that, you couldn't actually get ice, so you couldn't have ice cream. And I would mention self-sufficiency when I was talking downstairs about the buttery. But items like this, for example, it's a candle maker. They used to make their own candles. So, you know, it's just such an insight into how these families lived in the past and our history as well. I mentioned that this place gives you a really good insight into ways people lived in the past, and nothing makes me more grateful to live in 2024 than when you look back at how they used to do the laundry. Now, many of you might recognise this if you had them when you were children. This is what's called a copper, and it's where laundry was done. So the bowl sitting in this structure is made of copper, and that's where it gets its name from. Now in this, you would build a fire underneath. You would get water from a well, a stream, wherever you got your water supply from. You would boil it up on the stove or the fire. You would fill this up, you would add the clothes, some soap, and this was your washing machine. So there's no electric agitator like there is today. This was your agitator. So you would manually circulate the clothes like that, swirl them around. You'd have a stick like this as well. This was the hottest, hardest work you could possibly imagine, and it took so long to go through the process. So you would boil the clothes, you would use one of these to scrub the clothes on with soap, you would then get the wet clothes and put them in the draining basket, and then eventually you put them through the wringer. You might redo the process again with some brightening substances, like they used to put like a blue dye in there to make the whites look whiter. And then you would carry them out and you would hang them on the clothesline. As you can imagine, clothes had to be pretty tough to go through this process. So the more fancier items, for example, grand ladies' dresses, they would be washed very infrequently, and they always wore tough cotton or muslin clothing underneath, underwear underneath their fancy clothes, and that's what would come in contact with the skin, and that could be washed in this way. So As I said, quite hard work, hot. Imagine in the middle of a Queensland summer having to do this, standing over boiling water and manually stirring things and lifting these big heavy things. I think they're a lot tougher than I am, that's for sure. This is the part of the house where the families would have done their entertaining. So it was probably something like a lounge dining situation, but you can see here these amazing timber folding doors. So they actually would have closed to separate the space into 2 rooms. And then when they were having people over, maybe for a big dance or other social event like that, they would throw these open and create one big room with a fireplace at either end. And it's such a beautiful space. Originally it had a pressed metal ceiling, or at some point it had a pressed metal ceiling, and as I mentioned outside, when they demolished the nursery, they actually, in the 60s, they actually reused the cladding from that to line the ceiling in here, and the width of the boards is absolutely incredible, but just a wonderful space. And you can picture the men and women dressed in their finery dancing here of a night time and having a wonderful time. One of the other remarkable things about this property is some of the old trees that survive. So in front of the house is a fig tree that's thought to have been planted by Simpson when he first settled here in around 1852. He had William Pettigrew lay out the property and do a gardening scheme for him. So many of you will recognise that name. William Pettigrew was also another very important figure in early Brisbane. There's also a king orchid that is growing on this fig tree that's thought to date from that period as well. So as you're walking around the gardens, there's this sense of history as well, not just in the house. Well, that pretty much brings us to the end of this tour. I hope you've enjoyed having a look around this remarkable property, and I just wanted to say a huge thanks to Erin, the manager out here, and Lisa, who's in charge of the educational program. So she takes kids through and shows them all these old ways of living, which I think is so cool. And I have to say a massive thank you to all the volunteers who are responsible for maintaining and caring for this house. They do an amazing job, and the fact that this place is still here is still a credit to them. Wolston House is open to the public, and I strongly encourage you to come and have a look for yourself, because it just will not do it justice on this video. It's so fun to have a roam around and a reminisce and have a bit of nostalgia about some of the objects that are out here. So make sure you check the website for details about when they're open. I'll put a link in the comments below. As I said, I hope you've enjoyed watching, and I hope you've learned a little bit about the history of this wonderful house.